Welcome back to Hopetales, where ordinary people become heroes, and hope rises when the world thinks it's over. The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, a mixture of rushing footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the distant hum of announcements blending into a restless chorus. Under the bright terminal lights, Aria moved quietly through the crowd. She was just 20, young enough to feel the excitement of travel and old enough to understand the weight of responsibility, though she had never imagined how heavy that responsibility could become. Her flight was a routine late-evening journey, the kind hundreds took every day without a second thought. She clutched her boarding pass with a calm, steady hand, not knowing that the thin paper would become the beginning of a night she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Outside the glass windows, the aircraft waited on the tarmac, its polished surface reflecting the glowing runway lights. It looked strong, steady, and ready, with no hint of the chaos hidden in its future. Aria found her seat by the window, the place she always chose. She loved watching the world shrink below her as the plane climbed into the sky. This time was no different. As the aircraft pushed back and the engines roared alive, she felt the familiar vibration through the floor. Passengers around her settled in, fastening seatbelts, adjusting pillows, flipping through in-flight magazines. Everything looked perfectly normal. And for a while, it was. The plane ascended smoothly, slicing through the layers of clouds until everything outside turned into a soft gray haze. The cabin lights dimmed, creating a calm atmosphere. Aria leaned back, letting the rhythmic humming of the engines lull her into a peaceful state. She watched the faint glimmer of the moon through the clouds, unaware that soon those engines she trusted would become the source of unimaginable terror. Half an hour into the flight, something shifted, so subtly at first that most passengers didn't notice. A faint tremor passed through the floor, a small shudder like a heartbeat skipping a beat. Aria felt it immediately. It was too light to alarm anyone, but she had flown enough to know that something about the vibration wasn't right. She focused, listening closely. The engine on the right side made a soft metallic whine, a sound that didn't belong there. Minutes passed, and the tremor grew stronger. The smooth humming of the engines changed into a strained rumble. The cabin crew moved with slightly tense expressions, hiding their concerns behind practiced professionalism. Aria felt her chest tighten. She glanced around. Some passengers were asleep, some watching movies, some quietly reading. None of them saw what she saw, or felt the unsettling difference in the plane's rhythm. Then it happened. Sudden, violent, unmistakable. The entire aircraft jolted downward with brutal force. Passengers were thrown back into their seats. Luggage compartments rattled. A sharp metallic thud echoed from beneath the wings, followed by a shiver that ran through the entire body of the plane. Oxygen masks didn't fall, but the lights flickered as if the aircraft itself had blinked in fear. Aria's heart pounded. She turned her eyes to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. What she saw made her blood freeze. The right engine glowed faintly, an unnatural, sinister orange. A thin trail of smoke spiraled behind it, barely visible against the night sky, but enough to send a wave of dread through her. That engine was overheating, badly. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from calm to unsettled confusion. People whispered, pointed, looked around for answers. The plane dipped again, sharper this time, sending a ripple of panic through the passengers. Items slid off tray tables. A few children cried. An elderly man clutched his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, struggling to maintain calm expressions, even as their eyes betrayed the fear they tried to hide. Aria watched everything, her instincts growing heavier with every passing second. Then the captain's voice came on, shaky, broken, barely clear through the static. The announcement was short, but what terrified Aria wasn't what he said. It was what happened next. The microphone cut off abruptly. Silence swallowed the cabin. No further instructions, no updates, nothing. It felt like the entire aircraft was holding its breath. Aria's pulse raced. Pilots never went silent. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, in the cockpit. She tried to look toward the front. The cockpit door remained shut, still and unmoving, but the stillness felt unnerving. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They had heard the same thing Aria heard. the fear beneath the captain's voice, the sudden cut of communication. Another jolt hit the plane even harder than before. The overhead bins shook violently. The lights dimmed again, then returned with a faint flicker. Aria could feel the descent. It was subtle enough to confuse those unfamiliar with flying, but she knew. The nose was slightly down. The altitude was dropping too quickly for a routine correction. Outside, clouds swallowed the aircraft, making the world vanish in dense gray. The smoke trail from the engine thickened. A faint burning smell crept into the cabin, barely noticeable but enough to make Aria's stomach twist. The plane banked sharply to the left, the damaged engine struggling to maintain power. Gravity pressed passengers to one side. Gasps filled the cabin. People grabbed each other, bracing for something they didn't understand. Aria stared at the cockpit door again. It remained closed. Too closed. Not a shadow moved behind it. Not a sound slipped through. Terrifying thought formed in her mind. The pilots might not be conscious, or worse. The aircraft continued its uneven descent, dipping and lifting as if fighting for control. Aria gripped the armrests, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Fear spread through the cabin like a whispered warning no one wanted to acknowledge. The right engine sputtered, coughed, and the glow brightened. The worst was yet to come, and deep inside, Aria felt an instinct rising, a pull toward the front of the plane, toward the silent cockpit holding answers no one wanted. The night that began, like any other, had now entered a darkness none of them were prepared for, and Aria's role in what was coming had only just begun. Fear moved through the cabin like an invisible wave, slow at first and then rapidly, spreading as passengers realized the aircraft wasn't behaving normally. The lights flickered again, the nose dipped slightly, and every movement of the plane felt heavier, more uncertain. Aria tried to steady her breathing, but her heart pounded so loudly she could almost hear it over the trembling roar of the engines. The burning smell grew stronger, mixing with the cold, recycled air. People shifted restless in their seats, gripping armrests, exchanging anxious glances. The cabin crew hurried up and down the aisle, offering comforting gestures but unable to hide the tension tightening in their features. Their footsteps were quicker now, their attempts at calmness more forced. Aria studied everything carefully. She watched the flicker of the emergency lights along the cabin walls. She observed the subtle tilt of the wing outside her window, how it dipped slightly lower each time the plane shuddered. Something vital was failing, and the one place where answers should have been coming from, the cockpit, remained frighteningly silent. The crew moved toward the front, gathering briefly near the cockpit door. Aria followed their eyes. They whispered among themselves, faces pale, postures stiff. No one dared knock yet, as if they feared what they might discover on the other side. The captain should have spoken by now, even briefly, even with a simple reassurance. But nothing came. Not a single word. The shaking intensified. A sudden lurch sent several passengers gasping aloud. Water cups toppled. A few overhead bins clicked open from the force, spilling small items onto the floor. Aria steadied herself against the armrest and rose from her seat. Her legs felt weak, but determination pushed her forward. She reached the aisle, walking toward the front as the plane trembled beneath her. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the aircraft itself was resisting, begging her to sit down, to wait, to stay where she was. But she couldn't. Something deep within her told her the pilots were in danger, or already unable to control the aircraft. When she reached the forward section, she stood a short distance from the cockpit door. From there, she could see clearly that no shadows moved inside. No sounds filtered through. Not even the faint shuffle of hands working controls. Absolute stillness. One flight attendant tried the interphone again, holding the device tightly as if willing it to connect. Static answered, nothing more. She lowered the receiver slowly, her expression sinking into dread. The plane jolted again, this time more violently. Metallic screech burst from below, like metal twisting under pressure. People screamed briefly before covering their mouths in shock, a baby cried. Someone prayed quietly in the back rows. The lights blinked rapidly, then steadied. But the moment left the cabin trembling. Aria's eyes snapped back to the cockpit door. She noticed a faint haze creeping from the bottom-edge smoke. Thin, light, but unmistakably smoke. The realization hit her with cold force. The danger wasn't just mechanical. The issue was inside the cockpit, not just outside the aircraft. The flight attendants rushed forward. One banged on the door with her fists. Another attempted the emergency override panel beside it, but the small indicator light didn't respond. The door remained locked, sealed tight. The cockpit had become a silent chamber, and the plane was flying without direction. Aria stepped forward. Compelled by instinct rather than logic, she wasn't a certified pilot. Not officially trained, but she had spent years fascinated by aviation, studying aircraft systems, reading manuals, and observing every flight she had ever taken. She knew enough to recognize that time was running out, and waiting would only worsen their chances. The crew looked at her with surprise as she approached. But there was no time for questions. Another violent shake made them all grab onto whatever they could. The right wing dipped dangerously low. The aircraft slid slightly sideways, a movement planes were never meant to make in calm air. Panic spread now uncontained. Passengers held hands, braced themselves, cried silently, some in disbelief, others in acceptance. The cabin grew louder with fear, yet the cockpit door remained the quietest thing in the entire aircraft. Aria focused on the small control panel beside the door. The override wasn't responding, but she noticed the screws holding the interior access latch were slightly exposed. If they could force it open manually from the outside, maybe they could reach the pilots. She motioned toward a nearby serving cart. The attendants followed her idea, pulling out a metal tool from its emergency kit compartment. The plane dropped again, a sharp, terrifying descent that forced everyone downward. Loose items flew forward. Oxygen masks finally deployed with a violent snap, hanging from the ceiling like yellow warnings of catastrophe. Passengers grabbed them with trembling hands, pulling them over their faces. The cabin filled with muffled gasps and rapid breathing. Aria felt the pressure shift sharply as the plane lost more altitude. Her ears ached. Her hands trembled. But she forced herself to continue. The crew jammed the metal tool into the seam of the cockpit door. The aircraft groaned around them, the structure creaking as though protesting every second. Sweat formed on Aria's forehead as she helped brace the door. The attendants pushed, pulled, twisted with desperate strength. Smoke seeped out faster now. The door was beginning to loosen slightly, but still held firm. They needed more leverage. Aria grabbed part of the cart frame, wedged it under the latch, and the three of them pressed their combined weight onto it. The metal hinge cracked. A faint opening finally appeared. Not enough to enter, but enough for a thin burst of thick, dark smoke to escape. The smell of burnt wiring hit them instantly. Sharp, electric, dangerous. Aria coughed, covering her mouth. The attendants' eyes widened in fear. Their worst suspicion was now confirmed. A fire had started inside the cockpit, and the pilots were still not responding. The aircraft shook harder than before, the warning alarms echoing faintly through the door. The altitude continued to drop, too quickly, too steadily. The damaged engine emitted another choking sputter, then a deep roar that vibrated the entire cabin. Aria pressed her hand against the cracked door, feeling the heat radiating from the other side. Something terrible had happened inside that cockpit, and the door they had forced open was the only path to answers. Inside that smoke-filled chamber lay the truth and the fate of everyone on board. The silence behind the cockpit door had now turned into their greatest threat, and Aria had no choice but to step into whatever was waiting inside. The cracked cockpit door hung crooked, its hinges bent from the force used to pry it open. Smoke continued to seep from the narrow opening, curling into the cabin like a warning. The air grew thicker, heavier, as every passenger sensed the danger growing beyond the thin wooden barrier. Aria stood on the edge of the threshold, her heart pounding, her lungs tight with fear and urgency. The flight attendants exchanged terrified glances, hesitating to push the door further. But hesitation was a luxury no one could afford anymore. The aircraft was descending far too quickly, and every tremor beneath their feet signaled the graveness of what waited inside. Aria steeled herself, pushing gently against the damaged panel until it gave way with a reluctant creak. The sight inside the cockpit froze her where she stood. The space was dim, illuminated only by a few flickering warning lights on the control panel. Acrid smoke filled the air, rising from a scorched section of the center console, where burnt wires curled like blackened vines. Sparks flashed occasionally, each one a reminder of how close the fire had come to spreading. The two pilots lay slump in their seats, unmoving. The captain's head rested against the side window, while the first officer leaned forward at a dangerous angle. Their oxygen masks dangled unused. The panel in front of them crackled with failing indicators, some blinking erratically, others darkened entirely. Aria's breath caught. The pilots were unconscious, possibly from smoke inhalation, possibly from the electrical fire. Whatever the reason, they were not returning to their positions anytime soon. The aircraft jolted again as though demanding attention. The plane was no longer simply descending. It was spiraling into instability. The wings shuddered under uneven airflow. The right engine sputtered violently, its dying roar echoing through the frame like a wounded beast. Aria forced herself forward, stepping into the cockpit. The heat from the burnt panel radiated against her skin. Her hands shook as she reached for the captain's shoulder. There was no response, not even a stir. She checked the first officer next. Same stillness, same terrifying quiet. The plane trembled harder, making her stumble. She grabbed the back of the captain's seat for balance. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but something deep inside pushed back. She had spent years studying aircraft controls, reading manuals, watching cockpit videos, absorbing every detail she could. Her knowledge wasn't official, but it was real. And now it was her only weapon against the falling sky. She slid into the captain's seat, pushing the unconscious pilot gently aside. The seat felt enormous around her, the controls heavy and menacing. Warning alarms wailed across the panel, each one demanding immediate action. The control yoke vibrated under her grip. The plane was slipping into a dangerous descent, nose slightly pitched down. Wind battered the fuselage from the outside, each gust making the aircraft sway like a ship caught in a storm. Aria's lungs strained against the smoke, but she focused on the panel. Half the instruments were dead or glitching. The fire had damaged crucial systems. The autopilot had disconnected. The altitude was dropping rapidly, each number on the faulty display sinking lower. She reached for the oxygen mask hanging above the captain's seat and placed it over her face, drawing in the thin but life-saving air. Then she grabbed the yoke with both hands, pulling gently to stabilize the pitch. The aircraft resisted at first, as if stubborn, then finally responded with a slow, shaky lift. The descent slowed, but only slightly. A low groan came from the right engine, a sound that made her stomach twist. The engine was losing power. Flames had not erupted fully outside, but the inner components were failing fast. The imbalance between the two engines made the plane tilt. Trying to drag itself into a roll, Aria fought the tilt, working the rudder pedals with uncertain but determined precision. The plane shuddered violently as she corrected its angle, each movement requiring more strength than she expected. The controls were heavier due to failing hydraulics. The aircraft was fighting her, resisting every attempt to stabilize it. She tried the radio. Static filled her ears. The fire had damaged part of the communication system. She switched channels, trying again and again, until finally a faint voice crackled through. Air traffic control was trying to reach them. Her voice barely worked through the mask, but she managed to send a distress signal. Not smooth, not perfect, but enough. The controller's shock was audible even through the static when they realized a passenger was flying the plane. But Aria had no time to think about that. The aircraft lurched again, and she focused entirely on keeping it steady. Thunder rumbled outside. The plane entered a cloud layer thick with turbulence. Lightning flashed across the windshield, illuminating the cockpit in stark white light. The storm outside was growing angrier, pushing the aircraft with unpredictable bursts of wind. The cabin behind her filled with muffled cries and fear. But all Aria could hear was the roaring wind, the wheezing engine, and the shrill warnings that filled the cockpit. Sweat drenched her palms. Her arms ached. But she held on, refusing to let fear win. The city lights appeared faintly through the clouds, distant, glowing, blurred. Hope flickered at the sight. Land was somewhere below. Runways existed. Safety was possible. But the plane was too high for landing, too unstable for navigation, and too damaged for a smooth descent. Aria needed help. She needed direction. She needed time. But the sky was running out of mercy fast. The right engine coughed violently, sending the aircraft into another sudden drop. Aria yanked the controls back as hard as she could. the pressure straining her muscles. The plane responded sluggishly, like a wounded giant resisting movement. Alarms screamed. Sparks flashed from the damaged panel. Smoke thickened. But through it all, Aria kept her gaze steady, her hands firm, her heart unbroken. She refused to let 240 lives fall under her watch. Outside, the clouds tore open briefly, revealing the faint outline of land approaching beneath them. It wasn't enough for a landing yet, but it was enough to fight for. Aria drew a deep breath into the oxygen mask, steadied her trembling hands, and prepared for the most terrifying phase of her battle, taking control of a dying aircraft through a storm. Completely alone, the storm outside thickened, turning the sky into a restless battlefield of roaring wind and flashing light. Each gust slammed against the aircraft like an angry wave, rattling the windows and shaking the fuselage. Aria felt every movement through the yoke, every shiver of metal beneath her palms. The plane was fighting her, fighting gravity, fighting time. The right engine groaned again, louder than before, its dying roar echoing like a warning bell. The imbalance intensified, dragging the aircraft into a dangerous lean. Aria pushed her weight onto the rudder pedal, her leg trembling from the force. The yoke resisted her grip like a stubborn beast unwilling to obey. But she held on, her knuckles pale, her breath uneven beneath the oxygen mask. Behind her, the cabin was chaos wrapped in fear. Passengers clung to masks, each other, their seats, their hopes. Mothers held children tightly. Elderly travelers gripped armrests with shaking hands. People prayed, cried, trembled, and stared wildly at the cabin walls as though searching for answers between the blinking lights. But the only answer left stood inside the cockpit. A single 20-year-old girl fighting the sky. The smoke continued to rise from the damaged panel, hiding parts of the controls in a thin haze. Sparks fizzled occasionally. The heat burned against Aria's skin, but she ignored it. Her focus remained on the instruments that still worked, trying to read the altitude, speed, and heading through blurry, flickering numbers. Her lungs tightened under the mask. Her eyes stung from the smoke. Her arms felt heavier with every second, aching from wrestling the failing aircraft. But the lights below, the faint, distant city glowing through the storm, reminded her she was not done. She forced herself to breathe steadily, clearing her mind. The aircraft needed stability before anything else. She adjusted the trim slowly, hoping to relieve some pressure from the yoke. The plane responded lazily, dipping slightly before evening out again. Not stable, but better. A faint crackle sounded in the radio headset. Air traffic control's voice broke through the static, distorted but urgent. They were guiding her toward the nearest airport, barely 20 minutes away if the plane held together. Aria nodded instinctively, though no one could see her. She needed altitude. She needed direction. She needed the plane to give her those last 20 minutes without falling apart. The storm, however, offered no mercy. Lightning streaked across the windshield, followed by thunder shaking the air. The turbulence struck again, more violent, more unforgiving. The aircraft jolted downward so sharply that everything not secured flew forward inside the cockpit. Aria was thrown against the yoke, pain jolting through her ribs. But she held on. She refused to let go. The right engine sputtered, once, twice, and then gave a final defeated choke. Then silence. Complete engine failure. The right side of the plane went dead, the propellers slowing to a stop. The aircraft lurched sideways, dropping nose first, pulled by the weight of its own imbalance. Fear surged through Aria's veins like a rush of ice. She gripped the controls with every ounce of strength left in her. The stall warning blared. The cockpit shuddered. The plane trembled violently. The ground rushed closer through the clouds. She could see now faint outlines of fields, roads, scattered lights, all rising toward them at terrifying speed. She pulled the yoke back with everything she had. Her arms screamed in agony. Her shoulders burned. Her vision blurred. But she didn't let go. Slowly, painfully, the aircraft's nose lifted. The sharp descent softened into a shaky glide. Not safe, not steady, but survivable. She checked the left engine, and the only one still alive. It coughed under the strain, but continued to push the plane forward. Just enough. Barely enough. Air traffic control's voice guided her through the descent path. Her shaking fingers adjusted the throttle carefully. She aligned the aircraft with the faint outline of the runway, lights now appearing through the storm clouds. It felt impossible. Landing a crippled aircraft, half blind in a storm, with one engine gone, systems failing, and a cockpit filled with smoke. But impossible was no longer something Aria accepted. The runway grew clearer, the lights forming two glowing lines cutting through the darkness. She aimed the nose toward them, keeping her hands steady despite the tremors running through her arms. The aircraft glided lower, closer. The ground approached with terrifying speed. The storm winds tried to push the plane off course, but Aria fought them with every strained muscle. The left engine strained loudly as if giving everything it had left. The plane dipped dangerously low on one side, but she corrected it desperately. The runway lights reflected in her eyes. Moments stretched into eternity. Then, the wheels struck the ground with a violent jolt. The plane bounced once, then again. Metal screamed. The aircraft skidded sideways, sparks flying from beneath the belly. Aria held the controls firmly, guiding the aircraft as it slid across the runway. Tires burning, metal groaning, the entire cabin shaking with brutal force. The world outside blurred into streaks of orange and white. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the aircraft slowed. Screeched, shuddered, stopped. Stillness swallowed the cockpit. Aria's hands slowly loosened their grip on the yoke. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Tears slid down her smoke-stained cheeks. She pulled off the oxygen mask, breathing the cool night air that seeped through the broken vents. Behind her, the cabin doors burst open as emergency crews rushed in. The passengers were evacuated, voices shaking, tears flowing, disbelief written across every face. All 240 lives, every single one of them, safe. Rescue teams reached the cockpit and found Aria slumped in the captain's seat, exhausted, trembling, eyes unfocused, but alive. The pilots were pulled out next, unconscious but breathing. Reporters and rescue workers would later call it a miracle. Experts would call it impossible. The world would call her a hero. But Aria, in that quiet moment, didn't think of herself as any of those things. She was just a girl who refused to let a plane fall from the sky. A girl who chose hope when everything else was failing. A girl who carried 240 souls through the storm and brought them safely back to the earth. She was just 20 when she saved the plane, and that night the sky itself bowed to her courage.